It began on a quiet Thursday morning, the kind where money hums through the walls and silence feels expensive. Inside the Whitmore mansion, a marble fortress sitting high above the Hudson, everyone moved like clockwork, every step rehearsed, every breath monitored. Because in this house, one woman's mood dictated the weather, Charlotte Whitmore. Everyone feared her. She was the billionaire's wife whose smile could cut glass and whose temper could clear a room faster than any storm. Staff whispered her name like it was both a warning and a curse. Her husband, Richard Whitmore, ran a nationwide investment empire. But everyone knew who truly ruled their world. Charlotte had the last word, on business dinners, foundation galas, and even the color of the sky if she decided to. At exactly 8:03 a.m., her voice echoed through the grand hallway. "Where's the new maid?" The question froze half a dozen employees mid-step. The air went still, the chandelier above trembling from the faint vibration of her tone. Henry Collins, the head butler, stepped forward, tall, composed, and visibly uneasy. "She's just finishing the breakfast setup, ma'am," he said. Keeping his eyes slightly lowered, Charlotte's heels clicked across the marble floor. "She's late." "I said 8 sharp, not 8-ish. If she can't tell time, she can't work here." In the dining room, Giselle Harris straightened the last silver fork on the long mahogany table. Her movements were calm and precise, but her mind was racing. It was her first week working at the Whitmore estate, and every day felt like a test she wasn't told the rules to. The other maids spoke in low tones about Charlotte's mood swings and how one wrong look could end your employment. Giselle had smiled politely at their warnings, but never believed in ghosts until she met one in heels. She heard the footsteps before she saw her. Sharp, purposeful, regal. Charlotte entered the room dressed in a silk robe the color of frost. Her expression was flawless and cold, like a painting that had learned to breathe. "So," Charlotte said, glancing over the table. "You're the new one." "Yes, ma'am," Giselle replied softly. "Giselle Harris." Charlotte's gaze lingered, not kindly. "From where?" "Atlanta, ma'am." "Atlanta," she repeated as if the city itself offended her. "And what brought you up north?" Giselle kept her posture straight. "A better opportunity." Charlotte smiled without warmth. "We'll see about that." She walked the length of the table, examining every detail, the placement of the napkins, the distance between plates, even the angle of the coffee pot. Then she stopped. Her manicured finger traced over one crystal glass. "This isn't polished." Giselle blinked. "I cleaned every piece myself this morning." "Then you missed one," Charlotte interrupted, her voice cutting clean through the air. "Do it again." "All of them." Henry flinched from the doorway. The staff knew better than to interfere, but Giselle didn't look away. She gave a polite nod and quietly began re-cleaning the set, each motion steady and deliberate. Charlotte watched, waiting for a tremor, a mistake, any sign of weakness. But none came. Giselle worked methodically, unbothered by the scrutiny. When she finished, she stepped back. "Would you like to check again, ma'am?" The challenge was subtle, respectful, but clear. Charlotte tilted her head, studying her like one might study a painting that refused to please them. "You have nerve," she said finally. "I don't like nerve," Giselle didn't respond. She didn't have to. Her silence carried something Charlotte wasn't used to. Quiet strength. Richard Whitmore entered the room then, dressed for a board meeting, his tie crisp and his face already weary. "Morning, Charlotte," he said casually before noticing the tension. "Everything all right?" Charlotte's tone softened instantly. "Just training the new help, dear." Richard nodded at Giselle with polite indifference and poured himself coffee. The conversation between husband and wife was like theater, polished, rehearsed, hollow. As he left, Charlotte turned back, her warmth evaporating. "You'll find I don't tolerate mistakes, or attitude. People either last here or they don't." Giselle gave a faint smile. "Understood, ma'am." Charlotte leaned closer, her voice dropping low enough for only her to hear. "I've broken stronger women than you." That was the moment Henry Collins, standing quietly by the door, realized something he'd never seen before. Someone who didn't flinch at Charlotte Whitmore. Giselle didn't shrink, didn't stutter, didn't even blink. She simply met her gaze, calm and unyielding. When Charlotte turned and left, the air seemed to breathe again. Henry exhaled. "She'll test you every day," he warned softly. Giselle wiped the glass one last time. Then she's going to have a long week. The butler paused, caught between admiration and worry. You don't know what she's capable of. Giselle's voice stayed even. People like her depend on others being afraid. That's their real power. For the first time in years, someone in that house said words Charlotte Whitmore couldn't control, and they were spoken by the maid she intended to humiliate. But that morning was just the beginning. By nightfall, the woman everyone feared would find herself standing in the middle of her own dining room, humiliated in front of her guests. And it would all start with a single act of defiance so quiet, no one noticed it until it was too late. By sunset, the Whitmore mansion glowed like a palace. Dozens of cars lined the driveway, headlights bouncing off marble columns and trimmed hedges. It was one of Charlotte's famous charity dinners, where the wealthy came to prove their generosity and measure one another's worth through diamonds and smiles. Every detail was orchestrated by her hand, from the imported orchids to the vintage wine labels turned precisely toward the camera crews outside. And tonight there was no margin for imperfection. The guests were some of the most powerful people in New York, senators, CEOs, even the mayor's wife. They came for her, not Richard, and everyone knew it. Inside, the staff worked in silence. The mansion's air felt electric, tense like the seconds before a storm. Giselle moved among them with quiet focus, carrying trays, adjusting silverware, and double-checking the seating charts. She had memorized the guests' names and preferences by heart. When Henry the butler handed her a last-minute change, she nodded without hesitation. Her calm unnerved the others. Most new maids by their second week were already trembling under Charlotte's gaze. Giselle moved like she'd been there for years. Charlotte entered the dining room shortly before the guests arrived. She was wearing an emerald gown that shimmered under the chandelier, her diamond earrings catching every flash of light. Her face was perfect, but her expression carried that unmistakable chill. "Everything ready?" she asked, scanning the table. Henry nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Ms. Harris has handled the final arrangements." Charlotte's eyes shifted toward Giselle, who stood by the window holding a folded linen napkin. "Has she?" she said, voice smooth but sharp. "We'll see." The guests began to arrive. Laughter, perfume, expensive greetings filling the air. Charlotte transformed instantly into the hostess everyone adored. Her voice turned honey-sweet, her smile flawless. She floated from one guest to another, each compliment rehearsed, each laugh perfectly timed. Yet every so often her gaze flickered toward Giselle, as though expecting her to stumble, to drop a glass, to give her a reason to humiliate her in front of this glittering audience. But Giselle didn't falter. Every tray she carried, every refill she poured was precise. She moved with a quiet grace that drew glances from more than one guest. "New staff?" one of them asked Charlotte casually. Charlotte smiled tightly. "A recent hire. Still learning," but her tone betrayed irritation. She couldn't stand that the girl everyone ignored was somehow commanding silent attention. Dinner began with the usual speeches, praises of the Whitmore Foundation, the new hospital wing Richard had funded, the endless parade of self-congratulation. Giselle stayed near the sideboard, refilling glasses, clearing plates, her presence barely noticed until the moment that changed everything. It started when Charlotte, in her usual fashion, decided to correct the staff mid-service. "The soup bowls are lukewarm," she said aloud, her tone dripping disdain. "Henry, what's going on?" Henry stepped forward, but Giselle beat him to it. Calmly, she placed another bowl in front of Charlotte. "This one's been replaced, ma'am. I tested the temperature myself. It's perfect now." A murmur rippled through the table. Charlotte froze. The correction had been polite, but it was public. "You tested it?" she repeated, her tone light but lethal. "I didn't realize we hired staff to make personal judgments about my food." Giselle's voice didn't waver. "Only to ensure your guests receive the best experience, ma'am. It's what you deserve." The words were respectful, yet the delivery was flawless, measured, confident, and delivered with such sincerity that Charlotte couldn't quite twist it into insubordination. A few guests even nodded approvingly, murmuring praise about attention to detail. The one thing Charlotte despised more than being challenged was being outshined. And tonight, a maid had managed both. She smiled through her teeth. "How thoughtful," she said, and raised her glass. "To perfection." The table laughed lightly and followed suit, unaware of the quiet war igniting behind that toast. By dessert, the air had shifted. Charlotte's mask began to crack. She'd spent years training her staff to fear her presence, yet Giselle seemed immune. When the coffee was served, Charlotte accidentally knocked her cup toward Giselle. Hot liquid splashed across the pristine tablecloth and onto Giselle's hand. The room gasped. "Oh dear," Charlotte said softly, her voice the portrait of false concern. "So clumsy of me. Are you all right?" Giselle glanced down. Her skin reddened slightly but not burned. Her voice stayed calm. "I'm fine, ma'am. It was an accident." She dabbed the spill with a napkin, her motions careful, controlled. Then, without looking up, she said quietly enough for those closest to hear, "But accidents usually happen when people forget to slow down." The words hung in the air, gentle on the surface but the undertone unmistakable. A few guests exchanged glances. Even Richard's brow furrowed, sensing the tension building. Charlotte's jaw tightened. "Excuse me?" she asked sweetly. Giselle met her gaze evenly. "I said I'll clean it up quickly, ma'am." "Would you like me to replace the tablecloth?" Charlotte's lips curved into a perfect poisonous smile. "No need. You've already made quite an impression." When the guests rose for after-dinner drinks, the whispers began. "She's bold, isn't she?" one woman murmured. "The new maid?" another replied. "I like her composure. Reminds me of someone who actually cares about their work." Charlotte heard every word. Her laugh came out sharp and brittle. The night that was supposed to display her elegance had turned into a quiet humiliation. As the guests departed, Richard approached his wife. "You were unusually harsh tonight," he said under his breath. "Harsh?" Charlotte replied, her smile fading. "She embarrassed me." "She was polite," he countered. "And she saved your event from that soup fiasco." Charlotte's tone turned icy. "Whose side are you on?" Richard hesitated, sighed, and walked away. For the first time in years, he didn't bother answering. The mansion emptied, leaving only the faint scent of perfume and the echo of laughter fading into the night. Henry approached Giselle as she polished the last glass. "You realize what you've done?" he whispered. Giselle set the glass down. "Yes, I did my job. You corrected her. In front of them." "I corrected the situation," Giselle replied. "If she wanted to be respected, she should have treated people like humans." Henry shook his head, though there was admiration in his eyes. "She'll come for you tomorrow." Giselle smiled faintly. "Then I'll be ready tomorrow." Upstairs, Charlotte stood by her window, staring down at the long driveway. The lights from the departing cars faded one by one. Her reflection in the glass looked almost foreign, angry, brittle, uncertain. No one had ever dared speak to her that way, and still walked out of her house employed. But this girl, this maid from Atlanta, had done more than stand up to her. She'd made her look foolish in her own kingdom. She poured herself a drink, the amber liquid trembling slightly in her hand. "Who do you think you are?" she whispered to the empty room. But deep down, for the first time, Charlotte wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Because something about Giselle Harris, the calmness, the certainty, felt like a mirror she'd spent her whole life avoiding. The next morning, before sunrise, Charlotte made her decision. She wouldn't just fire the girl. No, that was too simple. She wanted to see her break first. What she didn't know was that Giselle had faced far worse than a rich woman's rage, and by the end of that week it wouldn't be the maid who broke. By dawn, the Whitmore mansion was already awake. The kitchen lights glowed, the smell of fresh coffee filled the air, and the staff moved like ghosts, quiet, cautious, avoiding the echo of last night's tension. Charlotte Whitmore's moods traveled faster than sound, and today every servant could sense a storm brewing before she even came downstairs. Henry Collins gave curt instructions, his usual calm replaced by the tightness of someone walking a tightrope over fire. "Be careful around her," he whispered to Giselle. "She's been pacing since sunrise." Giselle nodded, polishing the silverware with steady hands. "Then she's already thinking of her next move," she said softly. "Let her think," the butler hesitated. "You really don't know what she's capable of." Giselle gave a faint smile. "People like her need control. The moment you stop giving it to them, they panic." Upstairs, Charlotte was doing exactly that. She sat in her dressing room, her reflection framed by vanity lights. Her hair was perfect, her makeup immaculate, but her eyes were raw with fury. On the vanity lay her phone, still glowing with text messages from her circle of friends. That maid handled herself well. She's confident for staff. I liked her composure, Charlotte. Compliments meant for Giselle. Every one of them felt like a blade. Charlotte exhaled sharply. She thinks she can outshine me in my own home? Lauren Pierce, her personal assistant, entered quietly holding a notepad. You asked for me, ma'am? Charlotte turned, voice smooth again. Yes, I want you to run a background check on our new maid. Everything, where she's from, family, employment history, financial records, if you can find them. Lauren blinked. That's a bit much for household staff, don't you think? Charlotte's expression hardened. She embarrassed me, Lauren. In front of my guests. I won't have someone with a past I don't know walking around my house, Lauren hesitated. Of course, ma'am. She left, her heels clicking nervously on the marble. Charlotte leaned back, her thoughts racing. Everyone thinks she's composed, she muttered. Let's see how composed she is when her secrets come out. But Giselle didn't have any. By mid-morning, she was in the garden trimming the rose bushes, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, the sunlight soft against her brown skin. It was the first truly quiet moment since she'd arrived at the mansion. She liked this space, orderly, peaceful, untouched by Charlotte's control. When Eddie Monroe, the driver, passed by carrying boxes, he gave her a nod. You really stirred things up last night, he said, his tone a mix of admiration and worry. Giselle smiled faintly. You heard about that, huh? Everyone heard, Eddie replied. Word travels faster than gossip in this house. She's been snapping at people all morning. Giselle clipped a rose carefully, setting it aside. Then she's showing me what I already knew. What's that? She's scared, Eddie chuckled quietly. You got guts, Miss Harris. Just patience, Giselle said. People like her always underestimate quiet people. Inside, Charlotte watched from the second-floor window. Her manicured fingers drummed against the glass as she studied the scene below. The maid laughing with the driver, unbothered, at peace. It infuriated her. Henry, she called sharply. The butler appeared within moments. Yes, ma'am. Have Miss Harris clean the upstairs study today. The private one? Henry frowned. That's usually off limits for staff, ma'am. I'm aware, Charlotte said, her voice clipped. I want to see if she follows instructions or boundaries. Henry's stomach tightened. Understood. An hour later, Giselle walked into the study with her cleaning supplies. The room was everything she expected. Rich mahogany, polished shelves filled with first editions, and an enormous portrait of Richard Whitmore hanging above the fireplace. It was the one room no one ever touched. She'd been warned to avoid it since her first day. But orders were orders. As she dusted the desk, she noticed something odd, a small stack of documents left half open, bearing the Whitmore Foundation's seal. Giselle had no interest in prying, but one detail caught her eye. Multiple checks signed under different names, all linked to the same account. Donations on paper, but the sums didn't match. Curious, she murmured under her breath. She snapped a quick glance around the empty hall before returning to her work. Whatever this was, it wasn't her business, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that Charlotte's fury and these papers were connected. Moments later, Charlotte entered without knocking. You're thorough, she said coolly. Few people clean this room properly. Giselle turned, polite but guarded. Just doing my job, ma'am. Charlotte stepped closer, her perfume heavy in the air. I've learned something about you, Miss Harris. You worked as a caretaker before this, correct? Yes, ma'am. For a family in Atlanta? That's right. Charlotte smiled faintly, but her eyes glinted with malice. Funny, I called them. They said you left without notice. Why is that? Giselle's expression didn't change. The wife passed away. The husband wanted to sell the house. My job ended. Charlotte tilted her head, disappointed by the calm answer. Convenient. You seem to attract drama wherever you go. Giselle's voice stayed soft. Or maybe people don't like being reminded of their own reflection. Charlotte's smile vanished. Watch your tone. Yes, ma'am. For a long moment they stared at each other, the silence heavy, unbroken. Then Charlotte turned sharply and left. Henry appeared minutes later, looking uneasy. She's testing you, he warned. Don't react. That's what she wants. Giselle set down her duster. She already got her reaction. I saw her face when I didn't flinch. That evening, Giselle sat in her small room at the back of the mansion, reading a letter she hadn't opened since arriving in New York. It was from her late employer's daughter, a woman who'd written, You have a rare gift, Giselle. You bring peace where people build walls. She folded it carefully and placed it back in her drawer. Downstairs, Lauren Pierce returned from her errand, pale and uneasy. She approached Charlotte in the living room where the glow of the fireplace painted her face in amber tones. "I did what you asked," she said quietly. "There's nothing on her. Clean record, no debts, no history, just normal." Charlotte's eyes narrowed. "Everyone has something." Lauren shook her head. "Not her." Charlotte's jaw tightened. "Then we'll create something." She turned toward the fire, watching the flames twist and rise. "Tomorrow I'll host a luncheon. Invite everyone who matters and make sure Ms. Harris serves personally. Let's see how well she holds her composure when the spotlight's on her." Lauren hesitated. "And if she doesn't break?" Charlotte smiled, cold and precise. "Then I'll find another way. Everyone breaks eventually." But Charlotte didn't understand the kind of woman she was dealing with. Giselle Harris had faced loss, hardship, and betrayal long before stepping foot in that mansion. She had built herself out of resilience, not privilege. And as the house settled into silence that night, one truth began to unfold. Charlotte Whitmore's power depended on fear, and Giselle had none left to give. The next day's luncheon would not go the way Charlotte imagined. Because when pride sets the trap, humility often springs it. And this time the woman with everything to lose was the one holding the match. By the time the morning sun climbed above the Hudson, the Whitmore estate was alive with preparation. A luncheon at Charlotte's command was not a gathering. It was a performance. Florists rushed in and out carrying arrangements of white lilies. Caterers whispered over last-minute menu changes, and the staff moved under Henry Collins' strict coordination. Everyone knew that today wasn't really about charity or publicity. It was about punishment. Charlotte Whitmore had risen early, calm and deliberate. Dressed in a tailored cream suit and pearls, she looked every bit the queen she imagined herself to be. But behind that poise was a glint of malice. Today's luncheon was designed for one purpose: to remind the staff and the world who truly held power within those marble walls. Giselle Harris understood that before anyone said a word. She could feel it in the air, an invisible pressure that turned routine into theater. Still, she moved quietly and efficiently, setting tables, arranging glassware, making sure every napkin crease was perfect. Henry approached her midway through preparation, his face lined with worry. "She wants you front and center today," he said softly. "You'll serve the main course. She's planning something. Just be careful." Giselle's expression didn't change. "Let her plan," she replied. "People who fight with pride forget that everyone's watching how they lose." Noon, the guests began arriving. Wives of city officials, museum trustees, and socialites who treated philanthropy like a competition. Laughter rang through the hall, clinking jewelry flashing beneath the chandeliers. Charlotte greeted them all with charm polished to perfection, her voice like glass, smooth, hard, and fragile beneath the surface. "Oh, this luncheon is special," she told them sweetly. A little celebration for the Foundation's latest milestone. And of course, and she added with a hint of theatrical pause, "We have a wonderful new addition to our staff who's made herself quite memorable." The guests murmured with polite curiosity. Giselle could feel their eyes on her as she entered carrying a tray of drinks, her white uniform crisp, her movements graceful and controlled. She smiled faintly, not out of obligation but quiet confidence. That alone unsettled Charlotte more than open defiance ever could. Lunch was served in the sunroom overlooking the gardens, a long table covered in lace and glass, sunlight streaming across the polished surfaces. Everything gleamed. Charlotte sat at the head of the table, the perfect image of elegance, while Giselle served with calm precision. For a while, the performance unfolded without flaw. Charlotte regaled her guests with anecdotes about European galas and designer mishaps, her laughter ringing like wind chimes. But beneath that charm, she kept glancing toward Giselle, waiting, calculating. When the moment came, she made her move. "Ms. Harris," she said suddenly, loud enough for the entire table to hear. "You worked for a family in Atlanta, didn't you?" Giselle paused mid-step, her tray balanced perfectly. "Yes, ma'am." Charlotte smiled faintly, turning to her guests. A tragic story, really. I heard the lady of the house passed under uncomfortable circumstances. You must have seen so much. Tell us, how did you handle it? A hush fell over the table. The question wasn't curiosity, it was a weapon. Giselle set down a plate and straightened slowly. With respect, ma'am, I don't speak about the dead, she said softly. Charlotte chuckled, feigning innocence. Of course. But you must admit it's rather unusual, moving here so soon after such a loss. Some people might think you were trying to escape a bad situation. The air in the room tightened. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Charlotte's smile widened. I do hope you're not bringing bad luck to my home. Henry's hand twitched at his side as if he might intervene. But Giselle didn't need rescuing. She placed her tray down, folded her hands neatly, and looked directly at Charlotte. With respect, ma'am, she said in a calm, clear voice. I don't bring bad luck, I bring hard work. But sometimes, people mistake that for a threat. The words were delivered so gently, they might have passed as humility, until they sank in. Several guests froze, their eyes darting between the two women. Charlotte's smile faltered. Is that so? She said, her tone growing sharp. Yes, ma'am, Giselle replied evenly. Some people see someone who doesn't break under pressure and decide to test how far they can push, but pressure doesn't scare me. It just shows me who's watching. For the first time all afternoon, Charlotte lost her composure. The faintest crack showed, a tightening around her mouth, a flush creeping up her neck. She forced a brittle laugh. Such confidence. You must have been quite the conversationalist down south. Mostly I just listened, Giselle said, her eyes calm. People tell you who they are when they think you're beneath them. That line landed like a stone in glass. The guests shifted awkwardly. One woman coughed softly into her napkin. Another muttered, How insightful. Charlotte stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. Thank you, Ms. Harris. That will be all, she said, voice taut. Giselle bowed her head slightly and exited the room in silence. The door closed behind her with a soft click, but the weight of her words lingered like a fragrance that refused to fade. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the guests, a senator's wife with an amused glint in her eye, leaned toward Charlotte. She's quite composed, isn't she? Not what I expected. Charlotte's lips pressed into a thin smile. She's insolent, she said. I won't tolerate it. The woman shrugged lightly. Still, grace under pressure. Rare these days. Charlotte excused herself before her fury could show. As she walked down the hall, her heels striking hard against the marble, she could feel her world tilting. The woman who prided herself on control had just been undone, in her own house, by someone she thought invisible. In the kitchen, Giselle stood by the sink rinsing glasses, her heartbeat steady. Henry entered quietly. You handled that better than anyone I've ever seen, he said, voice low. You made her look small without saying a cruel word. I didn't have to, Giselle said, drying her hands. She does that to herself. Henry gave a soft, incredulous laugh. You have no idea the ripples you've caused. Giselle smiled faintly. Ripples make waves when people pretend nothing's wrong. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the last of the guests departed, Richard Whitmore found his wife sitting alone in the grand foyer. Her eyes were fixed on nothing, her drink untouched. You disappeared from your own luncheon, he said quietly. Charlotte didn't look up. They laughed at me. They didn't laugh, he replied. They saw something you didn't. Her eyes snapped to him. And what's that? He hesitated before answering. That the only person in this house still has any dignity left is the one you tried to humiliate. Charlotte's breath caught, just for a second, but she masked it quickly. You're defending her? I'm saying you're losing control, he said, his voice tired. And everyone sees it. He left her there, staring into the dim glow of the chandelier. For the first time, the silence of her home didn't feel like peace. It felt like consequence. Meanwhile, upstairs, Giselle folded her uniform neatly for the next day and sat by the small window overlooking the garden. She thought about the words she'd said, the calm she'd kept. She hadn't come here to start a fight, but she wasn't going to bow to cruelty either. She had seen power before, real power, and it didn't look like Charlotte Whitmore. Down below, Charlotte poured herself another drink with trembling hands, the echo of her own laughter from earlier ringing hollow in her mind. She was realizing, slowly and painfully, that fear could command obedience, but respect, that had to be earned. And the woman who had just taught her that lesson was the one she had tried hardest to erase. But Charlotte wasn't finished. Pride, once wounded, always seeks revenge. And the next time she struck, she wouldn't aim to humiliate Giselle. She'd aim to destroy her. What she didn't know was that Giselle had already uncovered something powerful enough to turn the entire Whitmore legacy upside down. The mansion felt heavier in the days that followed the luncheon, as though the air itself carried Charlotte Whitmore's temper. Servants spoke in whispers, doors closed more quietly, and even Henry's footsteps seemed to soften against the marble. Charlotte didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her silence was worse. It made everyone feel like prey waiting for the hawk's shadow to pass. Giselle noticed it too. Every time she entered a room, the conversation stopped. Not out of cruelty, but fear of being caught talking to her. She'd become a symbol of quiet rebellion without meaning to. And in a house built on fear, that was dangerous. Yet she kept working, steady hands, calm eyes, never missing a step. But beneath her composed exterior, Giselle was watching, listening. And what she began to notice didn't sit right. It started small, an envelope left on Richard's desk addressed to the Whitmore Foundation, marked private. Then a phone call Charlotte took in hushed tones, followed by the sound of a glass breaking when she thought no one was near. But the real crack appeared one late afternoon when Charlotte called Giselle to clean the upstairs study again, the same forbidden room. Giselle entered quietly, aware it was another test. The curtains were drawn, dust catching in the golden light. Charlotte wasn't inside this time. The desk was open, covered in papers she hadn't finished sorting through. Giselle hesitated. She wasn't one to snoop, but the sight of an unsigned ledger half hidden under a newspaper drew her attention. The document listed donations, millions in supposed charity funds transferred to shell companies. The names looked harmless at first glance. Harmony Ventures, Briar Hill Consulting, Silverwood Foundation. But something felt wrong. The pattern was too neat, too repetitive. She'd worked with wealthy families before and had learned the difference between polished bookkeeping and deliberate deceit. As she examined the pages, her breath caught on one line. Donation transfer, 2.8 matters. Recipient, Charlotte Whitmore, personal subsidiary. It wasn't philanthropy. It was laundering. She quickly refolded the papers, careful not to disturb their arrangement, and stepped back. Her mind was racing. If this came out, the entire Whitmore reputation could collapse. Yet part of her hesitated. She wasn't here to expose anyone. She just wanted to work in peace, to rebuild her life quietly. But now peace was impossible. Later that evening, while the rest of the staff prepared dinner, Giselle found Henry polishing the silver in the hall. "Henry," she said softly, "can I ask you something?" He looked up immediately, reading the seriousness in her tone. "Of course. How long have you been with the Whitmores?" "Almost 15 years, he said, straightening. "Why?" "Then you know everything," she replied quietly. "More than most." Henry's brows furrowed. "What are you getting at?" She hesitated, then spoke low. "There's something wrong with the foundation books. Money's being redirected. Personal accounts." His face went pale. "Giselle, stop. Don't say that here. Not out loud." "I'm not guessing," she whispered. "I saw the ledger." Henry set down the cloth in his hand. "You don't understand what you're stepping into. That foundation keeps this family's image alive. You start asking questions, you won't just lose your job. You'll disappear from every reference book in this city." Giselle's expression stayed steady. "Then maybe it's time someone looked behind the image." Henry shook his head. "She'll destroy you if she finds out." "Maybe," Giselle said quietly. "But she's already destroying everyone around her. You just stop noticing." That night, Charlotte sat in her private lounge sipping wine and scrolling through her tablet when Lauren Pierce entered, face tense. "Ma'am, there's something you should know," she said carefully. Charlotte looked up. "Yes, it's about Ms. Harris." Charlotte's interest sharpened instantly. "Go on." She was seen near the study again. "The one you told her to clean. And?" Lauren hesitated. "She might have seen some paperwork." Henry looked nervous afterward. "I think she's asking questions." Charlotte's grip on her glass tightened until her knuckles whitened. "Questions?" She repeated, her voice soft but deadly. "About what?" Lauren swallowed hard. "I'm not sure. But if she saw anything she shouldn't have." Charlotte stood abruptly. "Then I'll handle it." That night she didn't sleep. Instead, she sat by the window of her bedroom, staring into the dark gardens below. Giselle Harris had become more than a nuisance. She was a threat. And in Charlotte's world, threats weren't tolerated. The next morning, Charlotte summoned Giselle to her parlor. The staff watched in silence as Giselle walked in, head high, her uniform spotless. Charlotte sat in an armchair, a porcelain cup balanced perfectly in her hand. "Ms. Harris," she said lightly, "I hear you've been curious about my husband's affairs." Giselle met her gaze evenly. "I've just been doing my work, ma'am." Charlotte smiled, the kind that looked like kindness but felt like frost. "Curiosity can be dangerous. People misunderstand intentions. I'd hate for you to misstep." "I'll keep that in mind," Giselle said calmly. Charlotte leaned forward. "Good, because people in this house tend to forget their place." "I don't want to see you make that mistake." Giselle didn't answer. She just gave a polite nod and turned to leave. "Ms. Harris," Charlotte called after her. Giselle stopped at the door. "If I were you," Charlotte continued, "I'd remember who signs your paycheck." Giselle turned her head slightly, her voice quiet but steady. "And if I were you, ma'am, I'd remember who's watching." Charlotte froze, caught off guard by the tone. Not defiant, but deliberate. It wasn't a threat. It was a truth. That afternoon, Giselle slipped a small note into an envelope and left it on her dresser. It read only one line. "If anything happens to me, look inside the Whitmore Foundation accounts, page 12 of the private ledger." Then she tucked a folded copy of that page into her apron pocket. Meanwhile, Charlotte was already plotting her next move. She called her husband's lawyer under the guise of updating donation protocols. But what she really wanted was protection, an assurance that no one could trace the transactions she'd orchestrated. She was too proud to see that her desperation was making her sloppy. Richard Whitmore noticed the tension too. That evening, he found Giselle in the kitchen finishing up. "You've been here a few weeks," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Tell me honestly, what do you think of my wife?" Giselle hesitated, then answered carefully. "She's a strong woman, sir. But strength and control aren't the same thing." He smiled sadly. "No, they're not." She looked at him for a moment, something unreadable passing between them. "You know what she's doing," she said softly. He didn't deny it. "You should be careful, Ms. Harris." "I always am," she replied. "But sometimes careful means telling the truth." That night, as rain began to fall against the mansion's glass windows, Giselle sat in her room and listened to the thunder rolling in the distance. Somewhere below her, Charlotte was pacing the halls, convinced she'd regained control. Neither woman slept. Both knew a storm was coming, and when it hit, only one of them would still be standing. Because in the house of a billionaire built on lies, the truth was finally awake. And this time, it had a voice. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the tension inside the Whitmore mansion hadn't. The storm outside had only traded places with the one inside. Charlotte Whitmore began her day the same way she did every day. Perfect makeup, measured calm, a smile sharp enough to draw blood. Yet her reflection in the mirror didn't reassure her anymore. For the first time, she could see it. The faint tremor in her hand, the crack in the mask she'd spent years building. She went downstairs to find Henry already waiting with the daily itinerary. "We have the caterer coming at noon for Saturday's gala," he said quietly. "And the board members are arriving at 6. Charlotte nodded absently, pouring herself coffee. "And the maid?" she asked casually, not looking up. "Ms. Harris is in the conservatory," Henry replied. "She's rearranging the floral displays." "Good," Charlotte said, her tone flat. "Send her to my office when she's done." Henry hesitated. "Ma'am, may I suggest—" She cut him off with a glance. "You may not." Henry bowed his head and left the room, his unease thick in the air. He had seen her like this before. Controlled fury, quiet calculation. Someone always paid the price when Charlotte Whitmore went silent. Upstairs, Giselle was finishing the flower arrangements, trimming the stems with delicate precision. The conservatory's glass walls let in the soft morning light, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe. The roses smelled of calm, something rare in that house, but peace never lasted long there. Henry appeared at the door. "She wants to see you," he said softly. Giselle nodded and set down the scissors. It was only a matter of time. Henry's eyes carried warning. "She's cornered, Giselle. Don't push her too far." Giselle smiled faintly. Sometimes the truth doesn't push. It just stands still until people run into it. When Giselle entered Charlotte's office, the air felt different, heavier, almost staged. The curtains were drawn, the desk unusually tidy, and Charlotte sat behind it like a judge waiting for a confession. "Close the door," she said without looking up. Giselle obeyed, her movements calm, steady. Charlotte clasped her hands on the desk. "I want to clear something up," she began smoothly. "I know you've seen things that aren't your concern. Financial documents, ledgers, whatever you think you found." "I didn't go looking," Giselle said softly. "You left the drawer open." Charlotte's lips curved. "And curiosity got the better of you." The mansion that once glittered with galas was put up for sale, its furniture auctioned piece by piece. The chandeliers went first, the marble statues next. Even the grand piano, the one she'd once bought just for show, was crated up and carried away. And through it all, Charlotte watched unblinking until the movers reached the last item, a portrait of her and Richard, smiling for the cameras years ago. She stopped them. "Leave it," she said quietly. "Let the walls remember something." By the time the house was empty, she was no longer the woman society feared. She was just another name on a court docket, facing charges of fraud and tax evasion. The hearing was merciless. The prosecutor detailed every transaction, every false receipt. Charlotte sat motionless, dressed in black, her pearl necklace replaced by the dull glint of courtroom light. When the verdict was read, guilty on multiple counts, she didn't cry. She only closed her eyes and whispered, "So this is what truth sounds like." Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions again, but she didn't answer. For the first time, she had nothing left to say. Meanwhile, life for Giselle Harris began to change in quieter, gentler ways. The story of the maid who exposed the millionaire spread online, though she never confirmed it was her. Still, people recognized her calm face in one leaked photo, a woman standing in the background of a charity event, holding a tray, watching the powerful unravel. Letters began arriving, some from strangers thanking her for her courage, others from people who'd worked under abusive employers, writing that her story had given them the strength to walk away. One morning, she received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single page, a check for $20,000 and a handwritten note that read, "For your strength, not your silence." R.W., she didn't need to guess who sent it. Richard Whitmore had vanished from the public eye, but it seemed he hadn't vanished from conscience. Giselle used the money not for herself, but to start something she'd always dreamed of, a non-profit helping domestic workers learn financial literacy, tenant rights, and self-advocacy. She called it the Horizon Project. When a local news station interviewed her about it, she kept her words simple. People think silence keeps them safe. It doesn't. It keeps others in control. The moment you speak, even softly, the walls start to shake. The project grew fast. Within months, volunteers joined from nearby cities. Churches offered spaces. Donors, real ones, stepped forward quietly, moved by her integrity. Giselle never became famous, and she preferred it that way. She worked long hours, still cleaning part-time to make ends meet. But every night when she went home, she slept without fear. She had rebuilt her life, not on power but peace. 2 years later, on a gray autumn morning, Giselle received a letter forwarded from her old employer's attorney. The handwriting was elegant, careful. The return address read, Hudson Correctional Facility. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. "Ms. Harris, I imagine you didn't expect to hear from me." I debated whether to write, but the silence here leaves one alone with thoughts and regrets. You were right about fear. It was all I ever had. I controlled others because I couldn't control myself. I used money as armor. And when it cracked, I saw what I truly was, empty. The papers say I have 3 years. 3 years to think about the difference between fear and respect. I owe you neither apology nor forgiveness. You earned both already. But I hope if you ever think of me again, you'll know that you won. Not because I lost everything, but because you reminded me what it means to be human. Charlotte Whitmore Giselle read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. She didn't feel triumph, just closure. A soft, quiet mercy for a woman who had finally met herself. Weeks later, she received another letter, this one from Richard Whitmore, sent from a small coastal town in Maine. Giselle, the house is gone. The company sold. But I found something better than profit, peace. I'm volunteering at a shelter now. They needed help organizing donations. Funny how giving feels different when it's real. If you ever need support for your Horizon project, consider me a donor. This time, the honest kind. You were the only person in that house who ever told the truth. Thank you for that. R.W., she smiled as she read it, the faintest glimmer of warmth crossing her face. Spring came early that year. The Horizon project had grown enough to open its first official office, a small 2-room building in downtown Atlanta, painted in soft blue and white. On opening day, volunteers set up chairs and coffee tables, and neighborhood women brought homemade food for the guests. Giselle stood by the front door, greeting each person by name. When the event began, she stepped up to the microphone. She didn't prepare a speech. She didn't need to. I once worked in a house where everyone was afraid to speak, she said. People believed silence kept them safe. But silence only keeps you small. What I learned is simple. No matter where you work, no matter who you serve, your dignity is yours. Don't give it away. The audience applauded softly, some wiping tears. Afterward, she slipped outside, standing beneath the blooming dogwood trees. The city buzzed faintly in the distance, alive and forgiving. Eddie Monroe, the old driver who'd long since retired, pulled up in his pickup truck, smiling as he stepped out. You did it, he said, pride in his voice. We did, Giselle replied. All of us who decided to stop bowing to fear, Eddie chuckled. You know, I still think about that house. About her, Giselle nodded. I do too. But not with anger anymore. Some people need to lose everything to find their soul. He studied her for a moment. You think she found hers? Giselle looked toward the sky where the sun broke through the clouds. Maybe, she said softly. Or maybe she's still searching. Either way, I wish her peace. Eddie smiled, tipping his cap. That's more grace than most folks would give. Giselle shrugged gently. Grace is free, Eddie. Fear is what costs too much. They stood in silence for a while. The kind of silence that feels full instead of empty. Months later, Giselle walked through the city park early one morning. Children played, joggers passed by, and a light breeze carried the scent of honeysuckle. On a bench near the fountain sat a folded newspaper. The headline caught her eye. Former socialite Charlotte Whitmore released early for good behavior. There was a photo. Charlotte, thinner now, dressed simply, walking out of the facility with no jewelry, no entourage, just a paper bag of belongings. Giselle looked at the picture for a long moment, then folded the paper and left it there. Some stories didn't need revisiting. She walked home slowly, her steps light, her mind at ease. At her apartment door, she found an envelope wedged under the mat. No return address this time, just a small card inside that read, The truth may hurt the powerful, but it heals the powerless. C.W. For the first time in years, Giselle laughed, a soft, genuine laugh that sounded like the beginning of something new. She placed the card beside her window, where sunlight hit it every morning. Then she poured herself a cup of coffee and sat by the table overlooking the city. It wasn't luxury, it wasn't grandeur, but it was hers. She thought of all the people who once bowed to Charlotte Whitmore's authority, who feared the coldness in her smile. And she thought of how fragile that power had really been. All it took was one person refusing to kneel, because that was the truth no one taught in houses like the Whitmores. Fear only lasts until someone chooses courage, and when courage walks into the room, even the powerful start to tremble. Giselle Harris smiled to herself, sunlight spilling across her face, her voice barely above a whisper. Everyone feared the billionaire's wife, she said softly, until the maid made her remember she was human. Then she closed her eyes and let the light fill the room, her peace finally earned, her dignity untouched. And her story, at last, complete. No, Giselle replied. Integrity did. Charlotte laughed, a brittle sound. Integrity? You're a maid in my house. You think you understand what integrity looks like. You don't know what it takes to build a life like this. The sacrifices, the deals. The lies, Giselle interrupted gently. Charlotte's eyes flashed. Watch your mouth, I am, Giselle said. That's why I'm still here. The older woman rose from her chair, circling slowly like a predator. You think you've figured me out? You have no idea what I'm capable of. I do, Giselle said evenly. You're capable of hiding behind fear. But fear doesn't last forever, ma'am. It fades when people stop being afraid. Charlotte stopped walking. Her voice dropped to a whisper. You've made a very big mistake thinking you can talk to me like that. Giselle met her gaze, unblinking. No, ma'am. The mistake is thinking people like you can't be held accountable. Before Charlotte could answer, a soft knock came at the door. It was Lauren Pierce holding a thin folder. Ma'am, the accountants just sent the updated reports you asked for, she said, her voice tight. Charlotte snatched the folder, flipping it open. Then she froze. The color drained from her face. Inside was not the sanitized version she expected, but photocopies of the original ledger pages. The same ones Giselle had seen. And in the corner, stapled neatly, was a small note. Forwarded as requested, E. Blake. Lauren's voice trembled. I didn't send this to anyone, ma'am. I don't know how. Get out, Charlotte hissed. Lauren backed out of the room like someone fleeing a crime scene. Giselle stood still. E. Blake, she murmured. Evan Blake, the journalist from the Post. He covered your foundation's gala last year, didn't he? Charlotte looked up sharply. What did you do? I didn't do anything, Giselle said calmly. But maybe someone else finally did what was right. Charlotte's composure broke. You think this will hurt me? You think the press cares? I've survived worse than rumors. Giselle stepped closer, her voice low and certain. It's not rumors this time. It's numbers. It's proof. And the people you've stepped on to stay in control. They'll remember every bruise when the lights turn on. Charlotte's breath quickened. You don't know the people I deal with. You think this little morality act of yours makes you safe? You're just another name I'll erase when this is over. Giselle didn't flinch. You can't erase truth, Mrs. Whitmore. You can only postpone it. At that moment, Richard Whitmore entered, his face grim. Charlotte, he said quietly, holding his phone. I just got a call from the board. They've seen the documents. Charlotte turned to him, eyes wide. What? They're demanding a meeting, tonight. She swallowed hard. They can, he said. And they will. Charlotte sank back into her chair, her perfect posture collapsing under the weight of reality. For years she had built her empire on image and intimidation. But now all the power she thought she controlled was slipping through her fingers. Richard looked at Giselle. Did you have anything to do with this? Giselle shook her head. No, sir. But maybe it's time people stop pretending not to see what's right in front of them. Charlotte looked up at her, fury and fear clashing in her eyes. Get out, she said hoarsely. Get out of my house, Giselle didn't move. I'll leave when you sign my last paycheck, she said quietly. And you'll sign it knowing you finally met someone you couldn't scare. Charlotte's voice cracked. You think you've won? Giselle's expression softened. There's no winning in truth, ma'am. Just peace. She turned and left the office, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Henry stood waiting near the staircase, his face pale but hopeful. What happened? He whispered. Giselle exhaled. The truth happened. Outside, thunder rumbled again in the distance, though the sky was clear. The sound felt like an omen, justice, slow but inevitable, rolling closer. Later that night, when the board members arrived, Charlotte tried to face them with her usual composure. But the confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle edge. The questions came hard and fast about missing funds, falsified donations, manipulated ledgers. Her answers stumbled, her voice cracked. Cameras caught her pale face as she left the meeting room hours later, escorted by her husband in silence. By morning, headlines screamed across the news. Whitmore Foundation under investigation for fraud. Inside the mansion, Giselle packed her things quietly. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply folded her uniform, closed her small suitcase, and took one last look at the place that had once made everyone tremble. Henry met her at the door. She's finished, he said softly. They've frozen the accounts. The staff's being let go, Giselle nodded. Then maybe now people can breathe again. He reached for her hand. You did what no one else could. Giselle shook her head. No. I just stopped pretending fear was power. As she stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting against the long driveway that used to feel like a prison gate. The air smelled free again, and somewhere inside, Charlotte Whitmore sat alone in her now quiet house, realizing that the woman she'd tried to humiliate had left her with something she couldn't buy, bury or control: humility. But Giselle Harris wasn't finished yet. Because justice, like truth, doesn't rest after one victory, and she was about to make sure that the lies that ruined lives wouldn't just be exposed. They'd never rise again. The next 48 hours turned the Whitmore mansion from a fortress of pride into a hollow echo chamber of scandal. The gates that once shut out the world now stood open for cameras, journalists, and investigators who arrived in black cars and polite chaos. Charlotte Whitmore's kingdom, the flawless image she had spent 2 decades curating, was crumbling in slow motion. It started with one headline: Whitmore Foundation's finances under federal review. Within hours, every news outlet picked it up. By sunset, her name trended across the country, no longer wrapped in glamour but in accusation. Reporters shouted questions from the gates. Mrs. Whitmore, did you divert funds from your own charity? Is it true your husband's company backed your donations with false accounts? She ignored them all. Inside, she drifted from room to room in her silk robe, the same house now feeling foreign. Every mirror reflected a stranger. Every hallway whispered what she'd lost. Richard stayed in his office most of the time, phone glued to his ear, trying to contain what couldn't be contained. His voice was no longer firm, no longer commanding. For the first time in his life, he sounded tired. When he finally emerged one evening, Charlotte was sitting at the grand piano not playing, just pressing one silent key over and over, her eyes distant. They froze our assets, he said quietly. Every account connected to the foundation. The board's stepping down. I'm under review too, she didn't respond. They want your statement by Monday. Still nothing. Finally, he snapped. Charlotte, say something. Her gaze drifted to him, and for a moment the ice cracked. They'll move on, she whispered. They always do, he exhaled bitterly. No, Charlotte. They won't, not this time. You made sure of that. He turned and left her there. The sound of the door closing echoed like a gavel. Down the hall, Henry and the remaining staff packed quietly, collecting paychecks that might soon be worthless. They spoke little, each person looking to Giselle Harris for cues. She had become the quiet center of order in the chaos, her calm somehow holding the last bits of dignity together. She didn't stay for long. Her bags were packed. Her mind was already made up. When she stepped outside that morning, she didn't look back at the house. She'd spent enough days inside its walls to know that sometimes buildings didn't collapse from age or storm. They collapsed under the weight of their own lies. Still, fate wasn't finished with her story. That afternoon, a black sedan rolled to a stop outside her small rental apartment on the edge of town. Out stepped Evan Blake, the journalist whose article had torn the Whitmore illusion open. He was tall, sharp-featured, dressed in the same slightly rumpled suit she remembered from the night of the Foundation gala months earlier. Ms. Harris, he said, extending his hand. I think I owe you a thank you. Giselle looked cautious. I didn't contact you. I know, he replied. But someone did. Your note reached the right person at the right time. You may have just exposed one of the biggest charitable frauds on the East Coast. Giselle folded her arms. That wasn't my intention. He smiled faintly. Maybe not. But it was Justice's, she let out a breath. Justice doesn't feel like this, it feels heavy. It always does at first, Evan said. You tore down something powerful. That's never light. They talked for a while about truth, corruption, and silence. Evan asked if she'd go on record, but Giselle shook her head. The story isn't about me, she said quietly. It's about people learning that money isn't power. Character is. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. That's the quote I'll use. Within weeks, more truth surfaced. The investigation revealed that Charlotte had redirected millions of dollars in donations to fund personal properties, art acquisitions, and offshore accounts. Richard, though implicated, cooperated fully with investigators. Charlotte refused. She hired lawyers, held press conferences, and denied everything. But denial didn't stop the avalanche. Former employees came forward, donors withdrew support, and even her so-called friends vanished overnight. In the social circles she once dominated, her name became taboo, spoken only in whispers and warnings.